All right. Well, I'm going to dive in today and kick us off. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jessica Juarez Scruggs, the Director of Training and Capacity Building at the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Duwamish people in Seattle, Washington. I'm going to start off with a couple of quick reminders, and then we'll dive in today. First off, PCAF is a 501c4 organization, but I know that many of you are representing 501c3 organizations or you're here in your official capacity. So we're going to dig into a meaty policy discussion today, but we're not going to be engaging in an electoral or a partisan conversation during this session. So feel free to be here in your 501c3 capacity. We've also engaged the automatic closed captioning. If you go to the bottom of your screen and click on live transcript, down where the three little dots, if you can't see it, you can enable the closed captioning. Because it's AI, it's often imperfect, and we will actually send out an improved captions with the video when you get your participant toolbox with extra resources. I also have some bad news to share. Damon Hewitt, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, was going to join us today. We're very excited to hear from him, but he's feeling under the weather, so he won't be able to join us today. We hope he feels better soon, and we're looking forward to hearing from him at another date. For those of you who haven't joined us for the whole series, the goal of this training series is to dive into the policy systems that shape our communities, identifying the challenges, opportunities, and organizing strategies our movement can use to fight for a country where all of our families can thrive. So we're on to the court system today. I want to remind you, don't forget to sign up for the last session of our movement tool series for this year, which is on July 21st in 2 weeks. That one will be focusing on values-driven and battle-tested messages that each of you can use through our progressive playbook tool. So super encourage you to sign up for that if you haven't already. If you click the Live Now link and you're showing up as event participant to yourself, that means you're not registered. So go ahead and make sure you register for the series. My colleague Heejin just dropped it in the chat there. Click that link. And I want to be honest, this is the session that I've been anticipating most in the series. Anticipating is maybe the wrong word. I know I'm angry and grieving that the highest court in our land ruled against my bodily autonomy and ability to exercise my fundamental rights, putting so many of us at risk. As a femme queer person and someone who has been more than a decade in the immigrant rights movement, I'm afraid for myself and for my loved ones, and I know many of you are in the same boat. Abortion was a critical medical procedure for me in order to be the parent that I want to be. I'm reeling, and I know many of you are too. So in the face of all that, I'm really grateful to all of our guests for joining us, and I'm grateful for all of you to join us as we wrestle with the implications and talk about what we do next. And in that vein, I'm going to hand it over to our executive director, Gohar Siddiqui, to take it from here.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you for everyone for joining us today for this discussion. We're coming together in the wake of some really, really horrifying decisions by the Supreme Court. And the decisions that have come down the last few months are making it harder for states to enact common sense gun reforms. They're restricting the EPA's authority to take action on the climate crisis. They're making it impossible to sue the police if they fail to read someone their Miranda rights. They're attacking tribal sovereignty. They're making it harder for immigrants who are stuck in detention to get legal relief. And they've taken away the constitutional right to abortion. And the list goes on. So that's why I'm just diving in today. And there's no sugarcoating the devastating consequences that these decisions will have in the future and are actually already having on people in this country. And the pain that we're feeling is compounded by the fact that the Supreme Court decisions are made that have come out don't reflect the will of the people of this country. When we look at gun safety, 2/3 of Americans say we need more comprehensive gun safety laws. On abortion, 60% of Americans and 70% of women wanted Roe to be upheld. On climate change, 2/3 of Americans want to see our government take more action to tackle the climate crisis, not less. And all of these cases are really important, and I wish that we had time to discuss all of them, but we're only going to dig into Roe, the gun case, and climate change. But if you're interested in learning more about the other cases, please let us know, and we want to schedule follow-up sessions. But today we'll be hearing from experts who will help us understand the short and long-term implications of these recent Supreme Court decisions, the solutions that Congress can consider to deal with the consequences. This is a question I'm asking myself. How can we channel our despair into action? And what can be done to restore the public trust in the Supreme Court and make sure that it reflects the will of the people? And before we dig more into this conversation, I just want to acknowledge the painful moment we're living in, the anger that we all feel won't dissipate quickly. And I know that the people who are already shouldering the heaviest burdens will be impacted the most. So I'm hoping that this discussion will strengthen our solidarity with one another and offer us tools that we need to fight against the injustices that we're experiencing. And with those tools, we can build more just laws in the future. We can work towards a more representative democracy and a future where all of our rights are protected. So I'm really grateful for each and every person on this call for being a part of this effort. And I know that together we're going to succeed. So let's dig into our conversation with this incredible panel that we have today. First, we're going to dig into those three cases that I mentioned, and then later in the conversation, the panel is going to go over what you can do as advocates. So first, I'm really excited to turn the conversation over to Leila Abou-Fazli. She is the Director of Federal Reproductive Rights at the National Women's Law Center. She's worked on a range of issues involving the protection and expansion of reproductive rights. And Leila, welcome to the conversation. The first question I have for you is, can you just give us an overview of what's happened over the last few weeks since the Supreme Court took away the federal constitutional protection for abortion? Just give us a lay of the land across states that have already taken action and what this means for people who are trying to access abortion services across the country.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me today. The way to describe the last 10 days is sheer chaos and a true unraveling of rule of law in our country. I appreciate y'all having me here, and I will note that, appreciate those who've already shared their abortion stories and talked a lot already in the chat about the importance of this decision for people to be able to make on their own about whether or not to have an abortion, and what it has felt like on the individual level for the last 10 days and what it has felt like across the country as a collective and as community. And what we are experiencing in real time is we knew what was coming because we heard it in the oral arguments and we saw it in the leaked draft. But when we actually felt what it is like, it is incredibly scary how quickly things are unraveling. And so you have multiple states where there's no more abortion care. The Mississippi clinic at the center of the Jehu case closed, provided their last abortion care. There's some really beautiful notes on the outside if you go on Twitter and see. There are a lot of whiplash court decisions happening about is a ban in effect, is a ban not in effect, which, every day the ban is not in effect is good for the people who are able to get the abortion care they need, but it is really hard, the back and forth whiplashing with the providers, the clinic staff, and the patients. Do come in, don't come in. And just a reminder, a lot of these states before their bans even take effect, have terrible restrictions that delay and require multiple trips and unnecessary steps and be lied to about the care. So all of this is all happening at the same time. And so we're already seeing an uptick of people going out of their state for the care, but also just the fear of what this world we're living in. You know, as a lawyer for 15 years, I can't tell you how to perform a legal analysis of legal issues. And Sarah will talk more about this more broadly, but you in law, what you do is say, this is what happened in this previous case, and here is what it means going forward. We can't do that anymore because this lawlessness Supreme Court has just said, you know what, it's up to our whims what the law is. There is no principle here. And so what does it mean when people are asking me, well, what will happen to people who want to travel across state lines for abortion care? Are they protected? What happens to people's privacy online? Is that protected? How can we protect people if they go to other places for care? And and what about people donating to abortion funds? What about abortion funds? Are all these people safe, or are there risks? And we should have clear answers to these. Our country should have the rule of law, and the Constitution should be protected where the First Amendment should be protected, where privileges and immunities in the Constitution should be amendment protected. But we can't promise people anything, because what Justice Alito said is, I don't like it, so I'm getting rid of it. And 5 others joined him. So what does that mean for all of our other rights? So I know my colleagues are going to be talking about this more in other areas, but I can't underscore how deliberately the justices knew what it would be like to take the rug underneath the underpinning of a constitutional right to abortion and the disaster that lies in its wake. And just to remind folks that abortion has been a constitutional right for nearly 50 years. Our societies have formed around the right. And so you're hearing about universities. What do? We have students from states that ban, we have students that don't ban. Whose liability is it? We have teachers who their students reach out to them, therapists. Like, there's a whole ecosystem where people interact with abortion care and now don't know what the future is. And then the people who are going to be hit the hardest from those who can't travel, young people who can't travel thousands of miles, people with kids at home who can't afford to take off from work. Will they be protected if they take off from work? So it is chaos. It is wholly human-made chaos. They knew what they've unleashed. And we can talk about this more, but the really sad reality is that there's no short-term fix to this problem because of the way the anti-abortion movement has set up all their chess pieces across the chessboard.
Thank you, Layla. And as you're saying, I think we all understand that there aren't any quick solutions or short-term fixes, but could you break down for us what is happening in Congress? I know the president has said he supports changing the filibuster rules to codify Roe, but could you just dig into that a little bit more and describe the challenges that we're facing in Congress?
Yeah, so the House of Representatives has already passed the Women's Health Protection Act and also passed federal funding bills that would eliminate the Hyde Amendment, which restricts coverage. And these two pieces are big pieces of the puzzle of barriers to abortion access across the country today. Both, what are the restrictions in place that set up barriers for people to access? What are the bans in place that are wholly stopping care and shutting down clinics like we're seeing right now? And what do people do if they do have access but can't afford it and don't have coverage of it? So the Women's Health Protection Act would strike at this web of restrictions and just clearly state to the federal judiciary, these bans are per se prohibited, which is what you need with this federal judiciary that has been taken over by extremist judges. And so the Senate has tried to, has had votes on the Women's Health Protection Act as well, but there are not enough senators who support abortion access in the Senate to pass WIPA. Right now you need 60. And let me just do the numbers for you. 47 of the 100 signed a brief to the Supreme Court saying, no, get rid of Roe v. Wade. And so we don't have the numbers there. We also, in the procedural votes on Women's Health Protection Act, we had 49 senators vote in support of the bill, which also is not yet enough, even if the filibuster was reformed, but it's pretty close. But these are the barriers that are in place, is that we do not have enough lawmakers in the Senate that support abortion access. And so there are now there's going to be a series of hearings that are happening on what is this chaos look like. There will likely be more votes on the various pieces of the fallout. I mean, you all know that Justice Thomas took it upon himself to actually say that all those rights you care about, none of those are protected. All those privacy rights we've been relying on, really, telling his force out there that listens to what he says to really push the envelope, just like they did on abortion. They'll push it on these other things. So there will be these efforts to be clear about what does this country support and what does this country not support, and where the lawmakers land on that. So there will be I think, be paying attention to that over the next several months as we really get a picture of what this chaos looks like in people's individual daily lives. You're probably already seeing it on Twitter. People can't get care for a variety of reproductive health care needs, and it's just going to get worse and worse.
Thank you. Thank you, Layla. So now we're going to turn to one of the other major Supreme Court decisions from last week, West Virginia versus the EPA. I'm excited to introduce Doug Lindler. He's a lawyer, democracy advocate, and a political strategist who leads the League of Conservation Voters efforts in support of a progressive judiciary and a federal democracy reform. Welcome, Doug. So on June 30th in West Virginia versus the EPA, the Supreme Court narrowed the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. Can you talk about what this means practically for our efforts to keep our communities and our families healthy and our ability to reduce pollution in this country?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me and for organizing this event. I want to start by recalling something very important that Layla said a minute ago, which is in reference to Dobbs, the abortion case. She told us that Justice Alito saw something he didn't like, and so he decided to get rid of it, and 5 other justices joined him. And that is essentially the same thing that happened in the climate case, except that it was Chief Justice Roberts who wrote it. It is a little more complicated than that, but that is the top line. I want to give you a little more context on the situation here. So 15 years ago, when George W. Bush was president, there was a Supreme Court case called Massachusetts versus EPA, one of the most important environmental cases ever in the history of our country. And in that case, a conservative, but not as conservative as it is now, court made a 5-4 decision then saying, in 2007, saying not only could the EPA regulate greenhouse gases from power plants, it said at the time that the EPA must do that. And so there was a change in administration. President Obama came in, and the Obama administration put forth a great climate regulation called the Clean Power Plan, which would regulate greenhouse gases from power plants, one of the principal sources of pollution in the United States and thus globally. That Clean Power Plan got held up in court. The Supreme Court intervened at the time, back in 2015 or 2016, they intervened in an extraordinary way, something they've never done for any regulation before. While it was still processing through the lower courts, the Supreme Court intervened to block it. It was withdrawn by the Trump administration, which tried to put their own much worse version in place. That got struck down by a court the day before President Biden took office. So there is no current regulation in effect, either now or before, last week's decision, as to EPA regulation of greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. But even though there is no current regulation on the books, even though one of the few constitutional limitations on the Supreme Court's power is that they're not supposed to exercise that power in the absence of a live case or controversy, they decided to get involved and rule on the Obama Clean Power Plan that doesn't exist anymore, even though the Biden administration has said they're not going to bring that back. And in this ruling that they should not have taken, they exercised extraordinary power to say that the most important tools that underlie the Clean Power Plan, the idea that the EPA can regulate climate pollution from power plants across the grid rather than just within a particular plant, which is key to the vast majority of the value of those regulations, the court decided it's too important. Regardless of what the Clean Air Act actually says and what Congress intended, the court decided to substitute their own judgment for that and decide, as they've said before in other major questions doctrine cases, they've decided that the regulation is too important, and because the conservative justices have a majority, they wanted to get rid of that. And so the EPA still retains some authority to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. They retain a great deal of authority to regulate across many other issues. And this will have no effect on the ability of state or local governments or private sector actors to fight climate change. However, this particular authority, the authority of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, is the most important climate change fighting tool the federal executive branch has. And the Supreme Court has just massively weakened it in a largely unprincipled decision that is entirely a numbers game. The balance of power in the court has shifted, and they wanted to, so they did.
And so this is really interesting because we keep hearing about it's depressing and interesting, but this major questions doctrine that we keep hearing about. Could you talk about that a little bit? And also the court cited in this case that they basically relied heavily on this doctrine when they overturned OSHA's COVID-19 emergency vaccine requirements earlier this year. Could you describe this major questions doctrine for us?
Absolutely. So the first thing that everyone needs to understand about the major questions doctrine is that it is fake. And when I say it's fake, I mean, it is allegedly a constitutional principle. That's how it's described, but it doesn't come from anywhere real in the Constitution. It is something that conservative justices made up in the 1990s. Our Constitution was written in 1787. The major questions doctrine started the year the movie The Lion King came out. And so that gives you a sense of how constitutional it is. And it's something that conservative justices bring up when they see something that a federal regulatory agency is doing that they think in a very hand-wavy way that's largely absent from principle. And Justice Kagan in her dissent in the West Virginia v. EPA case had a great takedown of what they're doing in this way. But essentially what the major questions doctrine does is it allows conservative justices, and it is always the conservative justices, to substitute their judgment for that of a federal regulatory agency and say, regulatory agency, what you're trying to do here, it's too big a deal. The political implications are too big. The economic implications are beyond some arbitrary threshold that doesn't come from anywhere in the Constitution or any other law. And so we think we're going to say if Congress wants to speak more directly to the issue and more specifically say you can do this, then okay. But for now, given whatever authority underlied the regulation at hand, either in this EPA case or in general from federal regulatory agencies, which protect the people from the ability of powerful business interests to take advantage of them, the court just likes to raise the bar for those agencies to be able to do things, frankly, that they disagree with as a matter of policy or that don't serve the polluters or other business interests that helped get them the power they have on that court.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, can you tell us what's happening in Congress just on climate change and also in terms of this case?
Absolutely. So two things to think about here. Since the beginning of the Biden administration, the president and Democrats in Congress and many of us on the outside have been pushing hard for what we used to call the Build Back Better bill, but is now, a nebulous reconciliation package that doesn't have a name at the moment. But there, in particular, part of that is a major $500 billion investment in climate and clean energy that will be transformational and would be, if passed, the most significant climate fighting policy in the history of the United States. And that is a critical bill to pass, both because it is something we've come so far on and would be so transformative, but also critically because it's a budget reconciliation bill, which means it can pass the Senate with 50 votes instead of 60, even without changing the filibuster rules. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because when the Supreme Court made their decision in West Virginia v. EPA a week ago, when they severely curtailed the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants, that is a decision that in theory, is about whether Congress has spoken specifically enough in giving the EPA this authority. So in theory, Congress could pass a new bill shoring up the Clean Air Act authority and saying the EPA can do what the Obama administration wanted to do in the Clean Power Plan. But passing that kind of bill would take 60 votes in the Senate, or filibuster reform. And for the moment, we don't have the votes for either of those things. So in order to make sure that climate action actually passes in this Congress this year, it's really important that we all double down on our efforts, as we at the League of Conservation Voters are, to make sure that they pass that reconciliation bill with that $500 billion in climate and clean energy investments. It's also really important that the EPA use the remaining regulatory authority it has to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. And with respect to Congress, we also believe strongly at LCV that it's really important for the future of our climate, for the future of our environment and our democracy, that Congress expand the Supreme Court by adding 4 justices to rebalance its majority, as well as filling the more than 100 current vacancies on the lower federal courts by the end of this year with pro-environment, pro-democracy, and pro-choice judges. Because if that doesn't happen by the end of this year, there could be a change in the balance of power in the Senate, and those vacancies could be held over to try to preserve them for a future right-wing president to fill. And again, these are all lifetime appointments.
Very good points. And we're going to get a little more into court reform later in the conversation. Thanks so much, Doug. So now I'm very excited to introduce Brynn Jones, who's a legal associate with March for Our Lives. Brynn works to promote legal and constitutional engagement for young people. And the legal team there, they've been involved in amicus briefs to fight for common sense gun ownership reform. Brynn, can you describe for us the ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Brynn and the effect this decision will have on our ability to keep our public spaces safe?
Of course, and thank you so much again for having me on. This case concerns a century-old New York law around a gun regulation called proper cause. Essentially, what this gun regulation says is that you have to have a good reason to want to carry a gun with you into a public space. This type of regulation is called a may issue law. There are 7 states that have may issue laws, and they house a quarter of the US population, and they have some of the lowest rates of gun deaths in the entire country. So this case considered if New York's law was overly inhibiting to gun ownership. The court not only found that it was overly inhibiting and struck down the New York law, but they also ruled more expansively. Justice Thomas, writing for the majority, wrote essentially that the right of people to have a gun in public is true. It expanded a 2008 case called DC v. Heller, which for the very first time in the US's history, after 217 years of jurisprudence that said that the state had absolute authority over who could carry a gun and when, basically said that there was an individual right to gun ownership for the very first time, and that gun right meant that you had a right to have a gun in your home for self-protection. And self-defense. Thomas, in this case, expanded that jurisprudence to say that that is also a right that extends to someone who is in public. Since that 2008 case, we have seen a rise in gun violence. You see Castle Doctrine. You see stand your ground laws. You see a rise in gun deaths. We are going to see the same thing here. There are going to be more guns in public spaces, and we are going to see more gun deaths. So there's a couple of major things to consider here. The first is that guns are still not allowed in what are called sensitive spaces. Justice Thomas wrote a 50-page opinion on Bruin and spent about 3 sentences defining what a sensitive space is. All he essentially said is that sensitive spaces are a thing. They do include polling places, legislatures, and courthouses, which is very convenient for him, and that it is not just about when there is a group of people gathering that is or is not regulated by police presence. So this is going to be litigated in the lower courts. It is going to be something that is decided in various regions. You're going to have some southern states where essentially there's nowhere that you are not allowed to have a gun. You are going to see more guns in bars. You're going to see them at soccer games, in parks, and in bars, concerts, venues, everything like that. You're going to see them at sports arenas. You're going to see more deaths from that. And then you're also going to see some states and some regions that take a more conservative approach to what a sensitive space is, and it's going to, a more liberal approach to what a sensitive space is, and have more places where people are not allowed to bring a gun. Justice Thomas said that the island of Manhattan, for example, is not a sensitive space, but Times Square is. So this is going to be an incredibly vague issue. It's going to be a patchwork of laws because there's not actually that much jurisprudence to support something like this. Most of Justice Thomas's opinion was spent talking about what history can and cannot be considered when judges in lower courts are making decisions about where people can have guns. And it spent almost no time talking about the gun violence epidemic in this country, the 40,000 people that die of gun deaths every year, or the school shootings that have plagued our nation. The other issue with this is that probably the biggest and most detrimental aspect of this case was that Justice Thomas ruled that there is a new test to be used when evaluating gun regulations. DC v. Heller established a test that said that there are two prongs. The first is, does this regulation have a history and tradition in past gun regulations in this country? Does it fit in with what we've already seen? One would argue that a 100-year-old regulation in New York would maybe stand for that, but apparently it does not. But the other aspect of this test that Justice Thomas got rid of in Brynn was essentially, does this regulation do what it says it does, and will it stop gun deaths? And essentially what this court said, what Justice Thomas said, is that preventing gun deaths doesn't matter. It is just about the history and tradition. And then he spent 30 pages saying exactly what type of narrow history and tradition people are allowed to consider. When judges are allowed to consider when considering gun regulations. It's going to severely inhibit the ability of states to make their own gun regulations based off of the will of their people. 90% of Americans support more universal background checks and more background checks in general. We are seeing broad swaths of the population supporting more gun control legislation, to the point that we actually had our very first gun violence prevention legislation passed in the Senate in almost 30 years. And on that same day, this court backtracked in this way.
Thank you, Brynn. And actually, that is what I wanted to talk about next, is that new law, and whether, as I understand it, that law does give money to states to implement red flag laws, which would keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. And that law supports increasing mental health services, but it doesn't address the issues that are coming out of this Brynn case. So what can Congress do in light of this case?
That's a great question, and it's something that we at March have been really considering. I think that this case was that the gun violence prevention package that just passed is a good starting place, but it doesn't solve a lot of our problems. Even though it has provisions to count for red flag laws, we see shootings like what we saw on July 4th this weekend. We're seeing that these prevention methods that we're putting in place are not stopping people from falling through the cracks and still acquiring weapons when they shouldn't be. Some of the things that we're looking forward to right now, that we're trying to get past right now, that we think would help to at least begin to solve this issue of the gun violence epidemic. The first is called the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, which would provide federal grants to communities for evidence-informed community violence intervention and prevention programs designed to interrupt cycles of violence. One of the things that we do at March is we focus on the whole picture of gun violence epidemics. It's not just about school shootings. It's about poverty. It's about the mental health crisis in this nation. It's about political apathy. And this begins to solve that by looking at communities that are marred with violence and saying we need to do things to break this cycle, to break these cycles of violence. One other thing we're looking at is the assault weapons ban of 2021. It's essentially reinstating the ban that we saw back in the 1990s that was allowed to expire, to ban the sale, transfer, manufacturing, and importation of almost all semi-automatic weapons. The last thing that we're looking at, and what my team specifically is focusing on, is the Judicial Ethics and Anti-Corruption Act, which this fits more into the broader conversation that we're having about what do we do about the courts, right? What do we do about this runaway Supreme Court that does not care about precedent, rule of law, or the actual Americans that they are legislating to? They are essentially legislating to. And what this act is trying to do is, right now, the Supreme Court does not have a judicial ethics code. They are not bound to a code of ethics like any other judge in the country at the federal or state level. This would put Supreme Court justices for the very first time, it would bind them to a code of ethics that they must follow. So they are no longer allowed to accept the gifts, the political conferences that they're allowed to go to, and recusals would no longer be something that is left up to their own individual discretion. For example, the NRA donated combined almost $3 million to support the nominations of Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch to the bench. What this would do is not only would it force the recusal on issues involving the NRA, which I want to point out that the New York State Pistol and Rifle Association is the New York branch of the NRA. That is the organization that gave almost $3 million to give Justice Kavanaugh and Gorsuch their seats. And then we're not surprised at all that they voted for them. They literally gave them millions of dollars to get them elected to that bench to do this exact thing. So what it would do is it would force recusals in those cases, and it would also take dark money endorsements and outside influences out of our judiciary. If this was passed, it would actually, people wouldn't want to donate anymore because the justice that might be more likely to vote for their issue would have to recuse themselves. So this would instill ethics that are clearly lacking in this court right now. This court is lacking legitimacy. It's having a legitimacy crisis. It is not listening to the voices of young people, of women, of people of color, of communities that have been historically marginalized. So we need to go back in and we need to say, if you are not going to act legitimately, if you are going to act as a blatantly political body, then we are going to subject you to the same rules that we subject everyone else to.
Thank you very much, Brynn. And we're going to talk more about court reform now. I know everyone's asking a bunch of questions about it in the chat. So I want to turn to Sarah Lipton-Lubez. She is the executive director of Take Back the Court Action Fund. And for the last 2 decades, Sarah has been an advocate for reproductive freedom, gender equity, and progressive change. Sarah, we know that trust in the Supreme Court is at an all-time low. Only 25% of Americans say they are confident in the Supreme Court. So can you talk about, given the cases that we just went through, what kinds of reforms can Congress take up to restore the court's legitimacy?
Thank you so much, Gohar, and thank you for hosting this conversation today. You know, listening to my co-panelists give such important overviews of some of the most devastating cases coming out of the Supreme Court this term. We could spend a full hour and a half on any of them. And I'm just so grateful to each of my colleagues here for everything they're doing and all of the incredibly critical work they're engaged in. Stepping back, it's also really essential that as a progressive movement, we look at what ties all of this together. We look at how we got here, and we look at the structural reforms that we need to tackle this crisis head on. As you said, trust in the court is in free fall, and it should be, right? This is not an institution that deserves our trust. And that's because the court has torched its own legitimacy. We are dealing with a court that blithely overturns precedent, that cherry picks history, that makes up facts contrary to the clear evidence in the cases before it. This court just took away the fundamental rights of half the country and followed that up by taking a case that could bless election deniers' ability to steal the 2024 election. Right, as Layla said earlier, what the court is doing now isn't law, it's lawlessness. And it's only going to get worse unless we do something to rein it in. So how did we get here? Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, and yet Republicans have appointed 15 of the last 20 Supreme Court justices, including 6 of the current 9. 5 of those 6 were appointed by Republicans who took their office after losing the popular vote. 3 of them were confirmed by senators representing less than half the population of the country. The Supreme Court's legitimacy turns, at least in part, on its being democratically accountable. Instead, What we have now, if we don't act to change it, is 100 years backwards and forwards of single party rule on the court. The court has had a majority appointed by Republicans for over 50 years. And a recent study shows that without structural reform, we're most likely going to have a Republican majority for another 50. That is just overwhelming when you think about what a democracy is supposed to look like and how a democracy is supposed to function. So what can we do about it? So this is the good part. Hopefully it's the good part, which is that we actually do have the tools to fix this. And we can do that by expanding the court. The size of the court is actually set by Congress. It's not something that we talk about a lot, right? It's not something that you maybe like learn in your civics lessons in middle school, but that is the way that the Constitution has set it up. And so all that it takes to change the size of the court is a simple piece of legislation. There's a current bill, the Judiciary Act, which would add 4 seats to the court in order to bring it back into balance and to restore its integrity. And, you know, some people ask me, in part because it's not something we all learned about a lot growing up, right? Isn't expanding the court radical, right? That just feels like a radical thing to do. So here's what I would say to you. Expanding the court is actually the least radical thing that we could do right now. We're talking about passing a piece of legislation to set the size of the court as contemplated in the Constitution. It's literally Congress's job. So when we have 6 unelected extremists casting aside all norms, all precedent, the rule of law, trying to catapult us back to some kind of 1800s fever dream, I mean, honestly, what could be more measured and reasonable than court expansion?
Thank you, Sarah. And I know this question came up in the chat and it's been part of the conversation around different reforms. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of term limits on the Supreme Court?
So look, I think term limits are a laudable reform. There are a lot of reforms that the institution of the Supreme Court needs. I know Brynn was talking a little bit about ethics reform. It is absurd that there is no binding code of ethics for the Supreme Court. But the way that I think about this is, first and foremost, what we have to do is expand the court to rebalance it and to restore its integrity, and to have a court comprised of justices who care about things like the rule of law, who care about things like democracy instead of acting to undermine democracy. Once we do that, and we have that in place, there are a whole slew of things that we should look at as good government reforms.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So let's open it up to all the panelists. And I think the question that the audience is probably grappling with, which is, what can we do next? What action can each of us take to defend our rights and fight for the changes we need in each of these spaces and more broadly in the court? Why don't we start with Layla?
Sorry, I was trying to find
No problem.
my unmute, which always happens. So I think I just want to say appreciation again to this panel, because, you know, we truly are in this together, as our remarks showed. And I appreciate all listening to my colleagues. Actually, I've learned a lot, and it is really gutting to hear that it was a 100-year-old New York law. Like, it is ironic, right, that they're overturning a 100-year law and then sending us back 150 for abortion. You know, it's just, it has no rhyme and reason. And so for me, that actually is like a big takeaway, is that we're not going to get through this mess without all of us together in it. And folks need to just figure out, you know, what is the way for them to move forward through this mess, and which piece of it. All of your pieces are important. All of us are fighting for a collective freedom and liberation and safety and love of our families and communities. And so, I actually, you know, the Supreme Court gets that actually, and they want you to feel down and out and feel there's no future, right? That I keep saying it's a bit of checkmate, and it is like it feels like checkmate, and so you need a new chessboard. And so I want, all of our pieces run together. I'm very cognizant of the January 6th hearings that are still taking place. And really, to me, that is at the core of what we're talking about here. Is like, do we have a democracy that works or not? I'm really worried that we're at a dark time. And so how do you get through that? So that was a kind of like a high level, but I want to just take a note that actually sitting through this talk and hearing the through lines through our issues, hopefully you're hearing, this is where I fit in, and I'm going to keep fitting in, and I'm going to keep fitting in when I'm tired or don't want to go on a Saturday to something, like to remember this when you need to keep going forward.
That's really helpful. Do others want to talk about actions that the audience can take? And Doug?
Yeah, thank you. So first things first, I would love it if everyone on the call who lives in a state, I live in DC, so I don't have senators or a voting representative in the House, but for those of you who live in states, call both of your senators and your House rep, and please tell them how important it is to pass President Biden's $500 billion climate and clean energy investments. These would be really transformative. Again, the most important climate bill in the history of the United States, if we can pass it, and we're very close. And no matter who you're represented by, even if you think they are really good on this issue or really bad on this issue, they need to hear it, because it isn't just about whether they're going to vote yes or no when it comes up. It's, is it a priority, or is it being pushed for? Is it going to happen before Congress goes into recess, or before we get closer to election day, or things like that? There is a ticking clock. And when you're calling them, all three of them, please, again, both of your senators and your House rep, please also ask them to support expanding the Supreme Court. And when you're talking to those Senate offices, please ask them to support confirming more of President Biden's awesome slate of nominees for those lower courts. And again, even if you think they're really good on that, they need to hear it, because there are competing priorities. Things take time in Congress. It's not always clear what's actually going to happen, even if you think your member is good on these issues. So please call them and tell them, pass that climate reconciliation bill, expand the Supreme Court, confirm those judicial nominees.
Brynn, what do you think?
I think that one thing to think about in this moment is that it feels like you are incredibly divided from the tools to have power in this moment, right? I mean, I am a college student who's born in, who was raised and who currently lives in Tennessee. It's really hard to feel like my vote, my voice matters where I am right now. But I think that the thing that we need to consider in this moment is the power of local elections and the power that you have in deciding those local things. One of the huge aspects of this abortion issue is that local prosecutors, local AG offices, local DA offices are choosing not to prosecute these cases. They are choosing to say that this is a misdemeanor, that they are going to prioritize them under parking tickets. And when they do that, it essentially allows for abortions to take place in other states, even if in that state it is not being allowed because of gerrymandering and this minority rule that we're currently seeing. So I really encourage people to get involved in their local elections, to get involved with local politics, and to find how they can help within their local communities. Your voice matters so much more there, and grassroots is the way that we are able to empower people. That is one of the most important things that you can do. Does it make everything else that's happening right now okay? Of course not. But I think that focusing on that local effort is a way to feel a little bit more empowered in this moment of intense marginalization. I think that the other thing that you have to consider is, although burnout is real, trying to be engaged in this moment when everything feels so hopeless, that kind of burnout and hopelessness is real. But I think that you need to focus both on this balance of what can you do for your emotional health and what can you do for your country's health? And I think that trying to balance those health aspects, balance what you can do locally with what is going to actually allow you to be sustained in this fight and in this movement is incredibly important to think of in this moment.
Great. And I know everyone's asking for more resources. So we're going to send all the participants a toolbox of resources. So it'll have all of the bills that the panelists are talking about, and we can also help draft a script and you'll get all of this information after we're done with this session. Sarah, anything to add?
I mean, I just want to co-sign everything that everyone has said, from the way that Layla asked us to kind of lift each other up all together and stay in this movement together, the specific actions that Doug mentioned, calling your members of Congress, asking them to co-sponsor the Judiciary Act and the other important environmental legislation, the call to local action. I mean, all of it is so important. And what I would just add to layer on top of that is, I know so many folks on this call are part of organizations, local, state, some national. And so I would ask you to join the 130 organizations that are part of the movement for Supreme Court expansion. As we've all said, this court wants you to feel like there's nothing you can do to stop them, and it's just not true. And so as we continue to build this movement together, we're going to get stronger together, and eventually we're going to be able to make this happen.
Thank you. And we're kind of in this a little bit of positive space, so I hate to turn it over to the next question I have, but I do want to talk about the fall term of the Supreme Court, because this court is not done doing damage. So can the panel talk about what we can expect when the Supreme Court returns in the fall? What sorts of cases are on the docket? Why don't we start with you, Sarah?
Man,
yeah,
this next term, this term that we're coming off of, that we're only days off of, has had such devastating implications already for so many people across this country, and will continue to. And next term is not going to be any better. So I know, Gohar, you didn't want to bring us down, but we need to be real about what's going on and the fate ahead of us. So we already knew that next term the court was going to take up affirmative action. It's going to take up a case about LGBTQ equality, about redistricting and racial gerrymanders. And then on the last day of the term, right, to just kind of, I don't know, kick America in the teeth when it was down, the court decided to take a case that should really just like take our worry level and multiply it by 1,000. That case is Moore versus Harper, and it is truly impossible to overstate the threat that it poses to our democracy. This case is about, in part, something called the independent state legislature theory, which basically provides that state legislatures would have, frankly, near limitless power over states' election laws. And so state constitutions, state courts, independent commissions, all of that would get thrown out the window. This is a theory, so-called theory, that would have enabled state legislatures to erase the votes of its citizens and send presidential electors for the failed candidate, right? We already know both Thomases, Clarence and Ginny, are big fans of this theory. It is a theory that's been rejected by the Supreme Court time again for over a century. But it is also a theory that benefits current Republican politics. And so now you have a bunch of these justices like eyeing it like it's like that pie on the ledge in those old cartoons, right? And so everyone should have their eye on this case, should be paying attention to it, and should understand what it says about the court's intentions more broadly, which is that this court thinks there's nothing that can hold them back, and they can keep doing what they want. And that's why it's just so, I know I'm like a broken record on this, but it's so important to come together and say, you know what, we need to reform this court. Reform of the court has to be on the agenda going forward.
Others who want to jump in, Layla or Doug?
Thank you. So first, co-sign everything Sarah just said, but about the court and especially about this independent state legislature theory case, Moore v. Harper. This is, the latest in a long series of demonstrations we've seen from the Supreme Court over the last decade, and especially over the last couple of years, about how hostile they are to American democracy at the most fundamental level and how big a threat they are to that. I also want to say, if you think that last week's case about climate change was pretty bad for our environment, they're not done there either. When the Supreme Court comes back in October, on Monday, October 3rd, the first day of their next term, because the Supreme Court works on school years kind of. So the first day they come back, that morning at 10 a.m., they're going to hear oral argument in a case called Sackett versus EPA. Our two most important environmental laws are the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. So last week they just narrowed the Clean Air Act. This one's about the Clean Water Act. And the question is about whether to severely narrow not only the EPA's ability to regulate one particular thing in clean water, but generally, they are thinking about narrowing the scope of waters in the United States that can be regulated by the EPA to protect our clean water, to protect what we drink, to protect our health and our communities, and of course, so much wildlife. This is arguably a bigger threat to the Clean Water Act than the one we saw to the Clean Air Act last week. And it will not be the end. For all the reasons you've heard here, this court is going to continue doing things like this. And it's really important that we, no matter what the issue is that you care about, they're coming for it. And they will not be have their ideological ambitions curtailed by the law, because this is not about the law anymore.
And I'll just add one more. I don't think I heard it. The Brackean case, which deals with the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is a law that addresses the years of forced movement of Indigenous children out of their families, and prioritizes children to be placed within their communities, and a white family is challenging that prioritization and wants the Indian Child Welfare Act to be declared unconstitutional. I am not an expert on these issues, but I want to put on the radar that it goes to what Sarah was saying, like this should not be up, but it is. And there's a really good podcast, This Land, that I recommend if you want to listen more about the history. But again, it is to this idea, which the podcast really lays out, about like who has the right to the future. And the court is being clear that it is their right to rule all of us. And that's what this case also deals with. And versus like, you are being given the tools to grow and thrive within the principles of our democracy. And I don't think anybody brought up the school prayer case either, where, the coach is on the 50-yard line praying with his entire team. I mean, there are a real breakdown of the things that we have always considered as clear lines of separation. And just to note, in the Mississippi, the ban I just talked about, the Mississippi clinic closed right before the hearing on the Mississippi ban. There was a open prayer in the court. And so these are the things that we're watching for, maybe not next term, but in the fall, but how are they chipping away the separation of church and state, and whose rights get elevated over others? At the Law Center, we often deal with people's personal religious beliefs being prioritized, the healthcare needs of patients. And so it's a thing to keep an eye out too.
Thank you. And we're going to work to try to organize another movement tools series on the cases that we didn't get to talk about, but also these upcoming cases for the fall. But I'm going to turn it back over to Jess so that we can address some of the questions from the audience that we're getting. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And there are so many good questions. So I just want to say off the bat, we may not get to all of them. We will do our very best, and I may kind of combine a few so we can get to more. So the first question that we got that came up a lot in the folks who sent in questions in advance is a question about the shadow docket. What is it? And how is that playing into sort of the new links that this Supreme Court is going to? And I'll throw that out there to anyone on the panel who wants to jump in.
Looks like we don't have any takers, so I'll step up to the plate on the shadow docket. So, in order to talk about the shadow docket, I think we should just first talk about what's called the merits docket, which is what we've all just been talking about. These cases, these are cases that the court, grants kind of through their regular order. They're fully briefed. There's lots of time for briefing. People can weigh in. There's oral argument. The court takes time to consider them, and then consider them, decide what they want to do, but okay. And then they write an opinion that explains why they're doing what they're doing. Have a lot of thoughts about the quality of the opinions we're getting lately, but they do lay it out, right? Then we have what's called the shadow docket, which are emergency orders, emergency motions that come up to the court, and the court can make decisions on them without ever saying what they're doing, without giving a reason for what they're doing, without hearing oral argument, without even telling us sometimes, which justices voted which way. And, there have always been motions that, are urgent or timely for various reasons and that the court has needed to consider, but it has really in recent years completely transformed the way that they're dealing with this to really just create another tool for imposing really quite a radical right-wing agenda and not even trying to explain what they're doing at all. It's really become just kind of a pure expression of raw power. And so that's what we see with the shadow docket lately.
I just add, I think important to think about why we're hearing so much about the shadow docket recently, whereas we didn't even a few years ago. And the reason for that is that even though, as Sarah said, we've had a conservative majority court for half a century, the most conservative court in living memory is the one we've had for the last less than 2 years, since Amy Coney Barrett succeeded Justice Ginsburg in 2020. And in particular, not just because of that particular change, but also because of the other changes that happened during the Trump era and because Republicans in the Senate blocked Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee in 2016. And so, 10 years ago, the I don't want to say swing vote because he was still pretty conservative, but the median justice, the one who decided when there was a back and forth between the two ideological sides, which one would win, was Anthony Kennedy. And Anthony Kennedy was a Republican appointee. He was a conservative. He wrote Citizens United and Bush v. Gore, not great decisions, but he also wrote every important gay rights decision in the history of the Supreme Court that was positive. And he was part of the majority in Massachusetts versus EPA, the one that initially said the EPA could regulate must regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. But then he left and was replaced by a Trump appointee. And so the median justice became John Roberts, the author of Shelby County, the one that kneecapped the Voting Rights Act and many other terrible decisions. And then it went from a 5-4 conservative court to a 6-3 conservative court. So the median justice now, the one that court observers think is the one who decides when there's a 5-4 case, which way it's going to go, is Brett Kavanaugh, the one who swore under oath during his confirmation hearing that he would get vengeance against the Democratic Party, is now the median justice who decides as frequently as anyone else which ideological side is going to win cases. So when we hear about the shadow docket, it is a lot about them exercising their power in opaque ways that are less transparent and less justified by principle. But it's also about how far the balance of power in the court has moved in just the last couple of years.
Can I just say, absolutely. And you can't understand anything about what's going on with this court if you're not keyed in on the point that Doug just made about where the balance of power sits. I mean, it's just so absolutely critical to understanding everything about the decisions we just discussed and the ones that are coming down the pike.
Absolutely. And that's so clarifying. And that just watch that slide really is sobering. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here just for time's sake. But we got a number of questions on various cases about what executive actions we could be looking for that would, ameliorate some of the impact of these court decisions or prepare for ones coming down the pike. So we'd love to just open it up about what executive actions are you looking for from the Biden administration broadly?
Is that to me or to all of us?
We definitely got that question about reproductive rights. We also got it about climate. So feel free to.
Okay. I was like, who's taking that one? Doug, is it you or me? So just to preface, the HHS Health and Human Services have done several things since the decision broke about what are your protections and, navigating data privacy, which I flagged a real issue and folks should be very careful about. And then there are some other pieces that the Department of Justice has announced about protecting people's right to medication abortion and also the right to travel. And so I'm not sure if there's more coming on that end, but where we are, hoping that they can help people, especially in, for example, we're in an emergency, we're in a crisis. They should name it as such. This is a public health emergency and what that means for people's lives. And then also hopefully can do things like fund people's travel and the associated costs that they have in having to travel thousands of miles. So I think we're, just as I said earlier, abortion has been carved out of the federal code in so many ways that there really are trying to, the 50-year plan to overturn Roe was alongside a plan to carve it out of everything. And so the administration, it's not like they have a ton of tools to just turn lights back on. Actually, they don't have the tools to turn lights back on in the clinics. And so we're looking at ways that could support people's lives in this dark moment, understanding what the court did, and this is on the court. It took away the power, the constitutional right and ability to really restore it and without Congress weighing in. So there's a range, and just to be clear about the moral position of supporting abortion access and why we need it and why it is central to our economic security, bodily autonomy and dignity, and why it is important to fight for folks like Brynn in Tennessee. Like don't abandon folks. We actually need to double down and support people, especially who are in the center of the bans. So using their bully pulpit and being clear about it.
Yeah,
Dr. Brynn?
So on the climate front, a couple things. I think that the reason the Biden administration has not implemented their own regulation of greenhouse gases from power plants, the subject of this West Virginia EPA decision, is, this is not inside information, just my opinion as an outside observer. I think they're waiting, they were waiting for the Supreme Court to make this decision to see what the limits were that would be placed on them so that they could create a regulation that would be more likely to get upheld in court when inevitably it gets challenged. And so now that that decision has been made by the Supreme Court, bad as it is, it does leave the EPA some significant authority to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. It will be a more modest rule, but we need them to act boldly and quickly on that in order to use the extent of the authority that remains, and in order to do it soon enough that can be written, promulgated, go through notice and comment and go through all kinds of court process that could take a very long time and have it upheld during President Biden's term. That's really important, because if that doesn't happen before the end of President Biden's term, then we could see the same thing happen that happened at the end of President Obama's term, which is his clean power plan got held up in court. And then while that was still going on in the courts, President Trump came into office and withdrew it, and so it never actually went into effect. And when these things actually go into effect, they become harder to get rid of later. So there's that. There's also a number of other critical environmental issues we need the EPA to act on and that they can act on. One other brief thing I want to mention on executive action is on voting rights. There's a limit to what the federal executive branch can do on voting rights. We need Congress to act, but we can't change the filibuster rules. We don't have the votes for that right now, so we're not going to see major voting rights legislation this year. But there was a Clinton-era law called the National Voter Registration Act, which allows state and federal agencies to get involved in registering voters when they interact with them for any kind of public assistance purpose, as federal and state agencies routinely do interact with millions of people all the time. Very few federal agencies participate in this anywhere. There's some bureaucracy to it. I won't get into all the weeds, but bottom line there, we need more federal agencies to step up and participate in voter registration as they are able to do under that federal law, and work with the states on that to ensure that the maximum number of people are getting registered and participating in our democracy at this critical, perilous moment.
Also, just to kind of build on that, can you hear me? Great. There's only so much that President Biden can do in terms of executive orders on gun control. Anything that he did do would inevitably get turned back by the next president, regardless of its popularity with the US people. One of the things that we've really been pushing for is for him to establish a youth office, basically essentially a cabinet position to advocate for the opinions and for the rights of young people in this country, and also for more of a national emergency to be declared about gun violence. We're seeing more people, more children dying of gun violence than of car accidents. That's incredibly not okay. I mean, it's over 110 versus about 30 deaths a day if you're comparing gun deaths to deaths in vehicles. So we are also looking for President Biden during Obama's administration actually was the person who was assigned to lead a task force that was on gun violence. And he worked with on the Mansion Toomey bill that eventually did not pass. So it's actually incredibly astounding that he didn't take more of a role in the bill that just passed the Senate about 2 weeks ago. So we're really looking for more leadership on that because he is so well informed on that issue. And we're also hoping that he leads an effort to give the CDC more funding to study gun violence. When they tried to do so 20 years ago, Congress actually took away the CDC's ability to research, just look into the effects of the gun violence epidemic on this country. It took away their ability to look at it as a public health crisis, which is what it is. And so I think that what we're looking for is for him to start to turn the tide on some of those issues. Say, you know, it's not okay that gun manufacturers are one of the only entities in the United States that can't actually be sued. The only other people that can't be sued in the United States are judges. Gun manufacturers should be sued. We should be able to see this as a public health crisis. We should be able to have research on the impacts of gun violence in communities. And we should be having more efforts to solve all of the aspects of gun violence, to help solve poverty and racial disparities in this country, and look at the ways in which gun violence predominantly impacts those who are neurodivergent and those who are having ongoing mental health crises, and women, because women are often the victims of domestic violence, and that needs to be addressed in the way in which we are dealing with gun violence in this country. And we need national leadership on that conversation.
Thank you so much. And I want to refer to folks. We did actually do a whole session on executive actions just a few weeks ago. So if you did not, if you weren't on that call and you'd like to get more information about how executive actions work, feel free to drop a note to myself. I'll put my email in the chat and I will happily send you that for much more on executive actions. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. We got a number of questions that are touching on court reform generally, right? So questions about how exactly would expanding the Supreme Court work, how expansion and term limits could interact, or which one folks think is the right way to go, and also just like practically how would that work. So I think I'll start with Sarah, but also feel free to weigh in and everybody else. Could we just sort of talk through the nuts and bolts of what court reform would look like, and what the practical options are on the table, sort of our next steps?
Sure, Jess, I'm happy to start with that. And part of the thing about court reform and court expansion specifically is like the actual nuts, bolts, logistics of it. That's the easy part, right? The part that we need to work on, and that's harder, is building the political will to act, building the political will to look at the Supreme Court for what it is now, and not some idealized version of a fantasy that we want it to be. And that I think is where all the difference is made. So in terms of what it would take to expand the Supreme Court, the name of the bill is the Judiciary Act. It was introduced in the Senate by Senator Markey and in the House by Representatives Johnson, Nadler, and Jones. It adds 4 seats to the Supreme Court. And so what we would need to do to accomplish court expansion is to pass that bill and have the president sign it. There we go, court expansion. Doug, look like you want to weigh in.
I agree with everything you just said. The only thing I want to add is we at the League of Conservation Voters came out in favor of this bill and in favor of Supreme Court expansion generally just about a month ago in anticipation that the court would do precisely what they did on the climate case. The reason we endorsed this particular proposal instead of term limits or anything else is that this is the one that is unquestionably constitutional. This has happened before. Congress has changed the size of the Supreme Court 7 times before. In fact, when the court was first created during George Washington's day, there were 6 seats instead of 9. Abraham Lincoln expanded it during the height of the Civil War to have 10 seats. And so this is a thing that is unquestionably doable. Other proposals like term limits may be a good idea, and certainly like expanding the court is not going to solve every problem America has ever had with this court, but it is the thing that we can do that's most important to protect our climate, our democracy, our reproductive rights, and our safety, and so many other critical issues from the reactionary captured court that we have right now. And I think other proposals we might have, term limits or many other great things, may be more likely to be upheld if there were a court that were not trying to guard its power against the will of the American people.
Just to build off of that too, I think that that's a really important point, is this idea that the Supreme Court has always been minority rule, right? It's 9 people making decisions for the entire country. But what we're seeing right now is the extreme of that, where we are seeing political affiliations being prioritized over precedent, rule of law, and the will of the majority of American people in a way that we really haven't seen before. And in a way where, they are turning over precedents that have 50, 60, 100 years of support with the turn of a hat. I think that the other thing to focus on there is that these cases are based off of bad legal reasoning. I've been talking to multiple scholars about this issue, and it's actually part of the issue here is that the courts are not actually using legal reasoning to make these decisions. And the reasoning that they're using, it's not only is it not legal, it's not logical. It's cherry picking at its finest. It's political decisions at its finest. It's religious decisions at its finest. And I think that that's part of the issue here, is that they're not even doing their jobs. Not only are they not doing their jobs with the honor that we bestow upon a Supreme Court justice, they're not doing a good job as justices or as judges in general. Someone asked me in the Q&A why March is right now supporting the J. Paul Warren bill over the White House bill. Just for everyone who doesn't know, they're both very similar. They don't necessarily cover court packing, but they are both about instilling court ethics. I think that both bills are great. The reason that we've come down on the side of the Warren J. Paul bill is because it has more co-sponsors at this point, I believe, and it's a little bit broader in how it limits the ability of all federal judges to have direct control over their stocks, for example, gifts, and then the recusal process is a really big part of that.
And if I can just jump in, I just want to touch on one thing that Doug was saying about why expansion first, right? Which is also that expansion is what will have immediate effect. With term limits, you're looking at Amy Coney Barrett, at Brett Kavanaugh on this court 30 years from now, still in a majority potentially, right? And women, people of color, LGBTQ folks, anyone who cares about gun violence, anyone who cares about our freaking planet, like we don't have time to wait. Every day with this court, it can be a new crisis. And so it's really that urgency and the importance of acting to rebalance the court as soon as we can muster the political will for it. That is so, so critical.
And I think that point to political will gets to a couple of the other questions. Obviously, that's not something we can pass tomorrow, or at least I assume that's obvious to most of the folks on the call. We don't currently does not have the votes to pass right now. So wondering if anyone can talk about what we do to build that will, but also shorter term solutions. We had questions about what Democratic AGs can do, what state and local governments can do, and also a question about impeachment, since some of these folks were lied under oath or were appointed by folks who lost the popular vote. Are there other options that are shorter term. So that I threw a bunch of questions together there. So recognizing that that's a bunch of things, but I know we're running out of time. So just wondering if folks can talk about what building that political will looks like, and then also shorter term solutions that states or local governments or other branches could do right now.
So I want to turn it over to my co-panelists to talk about some of those other shorter term, other actions that are also so critical. What I would say about building this movement and building political will is things that matter are hard to do, right? We all know that there's no success I think any of us have had in any of the fights that we've all been working on for so long, where we came out of the gate and the next day we were able to do it without putting the legwork in, without working toward building momentum over time, so that when the window appears, when passage is possible, we have built the infrastructure and built the movement and built the support to allow it to happen. So are we going to get it done tomorrow? I wish we were. We're not. But everything that we do right now is what's going to make it possible for this to happen in the future. The Supreme Court is only getting more radical. This is a one-way ratchet. It is going in one direction. It is going to get worse and worse and worse. And so at some point, when enough people have grappled with that, we are going to get to expansion. I'm sure of it, right? And I think the question for all of us and the question, for our elected officials is how much harm is going to happen between now and then. So I know that Gohar and Jess and others are going to share out tools and information for everyone. But I hope this is an okay time to say that if you want to get involved in the fight for court expansion, please contact us at Take Back the Court. We will get you all the resources that you need, whatever that looks like for you to become a part of this movement. And we'll be so, so glad to have you in it.
I think an additional thing to keep in mind that I think is part of the question here that other folks in the chat have brought up as well is the crisis of legitimacy in our Supreme Court is part of a larger crisis of democracy in the United States. And so in order to ensure that we can win this long-term fight, we need to make sure that we continue to be a democracy that is capable of taking on these challenges. And in order to do that, we need to have pro-democracy majorities in Congress. We need to have pro-democracy governors, state attorneys general, state secretaries of state Supreme Court justices, state legislators in both houses of your state legislature, and your local election officials, be they county clerks or some other official. Every single one of those offices has significant authority to be used honorably or to be abused in service of continuing democracy or the end of democracy. And that is a real concern in the next few years in our country.
Thank you, Doug. I absolutely agree. We are at a moment of real crisis and a real crux in our democracy and in our country. And as someone who has been doing this for nigh on 20 years, I will say that continuing to build and build power and organize is so critical, even when it seems really dark, which it does at this moment. So we only have a few minutes left. And so we have questions. I'm just going to name these topics and give everyone a moment to see if anyone wants to kind of very lightly skate across the surface, because there are huge topics. But I will also say that I am taking notes about all the questions we got. We will, we're going to do more of these events. We are continuing to put out explainers and more resources. So if we don't get to everything, so I'm just going to name a few topics that we got questions about that we haven't had a chance to address. Give everyone a second to see if you want to try to skate across the surface. But again, I know it's so much. So we got questions in some of the other court cases that we saw either in this term or coming up next term. We saw, attacks on union organizing through Cedar Point versus Hassad. We saw, attacks on the ability to hold police accountable when Miranda rights. You can't sue to enforce Miranda rights. We saw some mixed bag rulings on immigration, but some really concerning rulings making sure that immigrants aren't able to challenge their detention as a class instead of one-on-one. So we got questions about all three of those. So I'm just going to stop there for a second and say, if anyone wants to share anything or other places to look, we will also try to pull resources for those to include in the folder. So just want to say that, but I'm going to pause and see if anyone wants to jump in on any of those topics.
I will skate super quickly, which is to say that, you know, one of the other themes that we saw this term, in addition to these just hit you over the head, over the top cases on abortion and gun violence prevention and climate, is this trend where the court is undermining rights and protections by getting rid of any remedy that you would have if somebody violates that right. So that's what we saw with the Miranda case that you just mentioned. That's what we saw with a case about Fourth Amendment rights and border patrol. We saw it in a case about ineffective assistance of counsel and folks trying to bring forward claims of innocence and the court just absolutely shutting that down. So even as the court continues to really be over the top in some areas, in some other areas, they're still trying a little bit to like hide under the rug what they're doing. And it's so important also to peel that back. And so we're looking at that as well.
Thanks, Sarah. So we have 2 minutes left. So again, I will say we will try to pull resources on all of the cases that we didn't get to that had questions today. And we will include all of the links and resources that we've talked about. And we were frantically taking notes in the chat, which was very busy. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for those amazing questions. And thank you for everyone on this call, but particularly our panelists, for all of the work that you're doing in this really critical moment. And I just want to say 2 of our panelists joined us from vacation. So that's how much this matters. We really, really appreciate all of your time, all of your expertise, and all of the work that everyone is doing to stand up for each other, hold each other in solidarity, and preserve all of our basic rights. So thank you so much for joining us. We will send out an email soon. So if you did not sign up in the link that Heejin dropped in the channel and you want to make sure you get that follow-up email, please do sign up on that link or shoot me a note. And then the last thing I'll say before we drop off is that our last movement tools session will be on July 21st at 1 p.m. That's Thursday, July 21st, 2 weeks from now. And we're going to be going over the progressive playbook, which and some new research that we did to support the progressive playbook, which is a 24/7 hub for progressive messaging that is battle tested and values led. And we're really excited to share it with all of you. So when you're out there having conversations with your friends and neighbors, and when you're out there organizing, we're really excited to share this tool with all of you. So I hope you sign up for that one, our last in the series for this year. So thank you, everyone.
One last thing, sorry to interrupt, because there's so many requests for the recording. Can you let people know they need to sign up with their actual name, not just event participant, in order to get the materials?
Yes, so we will send out the recording and a transcript to everyone who registered for this call. If you are showing up as an event participant, that means you clicked a live link, like a live now link, and are not necessarily registered. So if you haven't filled out the Airtable sign up, please do that so that we have your email. And if you put it in the chat, I tried to grab them all, but I'm not 100% sure I got them all if they were in the chat. So please sign up on that link and make that way we have your email and we can send you all of the resources that we've promised, including the recording of this call. He just dropped it in the chat. So make sure you grab that link before before we close out. I'll stay on for just a moment to make sure that the chat doesn't close and everyone can grab that link. And again, thank you so much to all of our incredible panelists. We are so grateful for all of your work and all of the amazing information you shared with us today.